Hello, this is Environmental Psychology, Part 4. Environmental Psychology, the field. My name is Sean Duffy. I'm a professor at Rutgers, Camden. And the series of lectures is part of an Institute for Offshore Wind that's part of Rutgers, New Brunswick. So today I want to do in this lecture, and I just want to, in speaking about where I am, I'm actually in a park in deep South Philly called FDR Park. And I figured I'd come out here because it's a beautiful day, and that's what part of environmental psychology is all about, is that sometimes our moods, our behaviors are influenced by the environment that we're in. So I figured early this morning I was sitting in my stuffy office, and I'm like, I have to get out and be in nature. And it's an appropriate place to be talking about environmental psychology, I think. So you might ask, what is environmental psychology? Why is it something which is distinct from general psychology? Well, general psychology tends to look at individuals and their internal endogenous mental models to explain thought and behavior. So a general psychologist is going to look at, say, processes that are involved in memory or attention or emotion to explain why they behave in a particular way, why they think in a particular way. Environmental psychologists tend to look outside of the individual and look at ways in which one's physical environment, whether it be natural or built, affects the way in which people think and behave. And I think that this is one of the more underrated subfields of psychology, because I think that we don't recognize often enough exactly how much our environment affects how we think and feel. We often say that, we get up in the morning, I'm in a bad mood. Well, is it a bad mood because, it has something to do within you, that you didn't have enough sleep or something? Or is it a great day outside? Or is it something more contextual, that, you're worried about something that has to do with your environment, whether it has to do with you have to mow your lawn that day or that you have to clean out your garage? Our environments play a huge role in what we do, how we think. And so I think that that's what environmental psychology tends to recognize. Now, there are some branches of psychology that do look outside of individuals. I, at some point in my career, was involved in work in social and cultural psychology, and that tends to look at how one's group's dynamics or country of origin affects one's internal mental models. And so I think that that is something which is very relevant and very important for environmental psychologists to understand as well. But I think that environmental psychologists are more willing to look at not social environments, but physical environments affecting the way in which people think. So I put this photograph here of the thinker, and this is like a 1950s photograph of a bunch of women looking at the statue by Rodin of the thinker. Environmental psychology, just like these women outside of the thinker, looks outside of the person to examine how the physical environments affect the internal world, which in turn affects how individuals act and indeed change the built natural environments. So a question an environmental psychologist might be interested in is, how does one's external environments, whether it be the schools that you went to, and not just the people that you met in the schools, but the physical design of those schools, affect how you think and act on issues that have to do with environmentalism? Okay, because there's some schools that have programs that have children go out into the natural world, like the park that I'm in right now, and engage in nature, and other schools that might not do that. They might not have the funding or the access to natural environments. So to what extent does your environment that you've developed in shape the ultimate outcomes on how you think about the physical world in which you live in? So in essence, environmental psychology is considered to be an applied rather than a theoretical branch of psychology, because there's many ways in which this knowledge is applied in contexts. So environmental psychologists are often hired by architects or by city planners or by people who are interested in urban design about issues having to do with, say, crowding, which is a huge issue in environmental psychology. Whether or not having too many people in one location stacked up in buildings is good or bad. And there are, I'll say, good and bad aspects of that. But environmental psychologists tend to look at these variables and try to understand how they interact with internal, endogenous, aspects of the human psyche. And in that sense, I think that it's a really fun discipline to be involved in. So, when did environmental psychology emerge? Well, you first saw people who claimed to be environmental psychologists in the 1960s. And there's no sort of accident that this occurred around the time that you saw other changes within the environmental movement. For instance, the development of the Environmental Protection Agency, which occurred in the early 1970s, the idea of Earth Day, which developed around the same time, but also the publication of books like The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which really brought to attention of the vast majority of Americans about the ways in which chemicals that we might apply to crops or to indoor environments might severely affect our natural wildlife. And interestingly enough, in this very park last summer, I saw a couple of bald eagles, which in the 1960s would have been impossible to have seen around here. But because of conservation efforts that were inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and changes in the regulations by the EPA, for instance, getting rid of leaded gas, these things have had an enormous impact on our environment, such that in a place like here, down in South Philadelphia, in the fifth largest city in America, you actually can see eagles and other wildlife that in the 1960s that would never occur. So I think that that's something which is really important to understand. That environmental psychology as a field emerged in the 1960s, combining psychology, geography, anthropology, and urban planning. So there were a variety of different aspects and angles to this field. And that's something which is persistent till this day. Part of environmental psychology deals with issues that we call eco-psychology, how people think about the natural world that they live in. Other aspects are totally removed from that. And, those environmental psychologists that work primarily with architects, they're not so interested in issues that have to do with psychology or sustainability. They're more interested in issues that have to do with the built environment. So it's a very broad field, I have to admit. And I've met people going to conferences and, exchanging emails and all of that they run the gamut of all different aspects of psychology. So it's a really fun field to be involved in. So in the 1970s, it expanded beyond the physical environments, considered more broadly an individual's embeddedness within a cultural physical environment. So I think that, at that time in the 1970s, there was a lot of research on sort of sociocultural issues and the environment. You see interest in how native populations, experience the environment different than those that are non-native. So those are issues as well. And in the 1980s, there was a movement towards understanding humans' interaction with nature, emphasizing sustainability and conservation. So that became a really important issue in the 1990s and 1980s, is sustainability. So at that point, you see lots of research being done on things like recycling, things like conservation, reducing CO2 emissions, things that are still relevant today. But that's where it emerged back in the 1980s. So what are some topics within environmental psychology? Well, one topic that I think is really important for all of us that study this is interactions within and between natural and built environments. So there's a branch of environmental psychology that deals with the idea that we originate from nature. We are animals, just like in this environment right now. I see some dogs, I see a beaver over there. We are part of the natural world, and we emerge from the natural world. But we also, build environments. And it's not to say that animals don't build environments as well. There's a beaver dam that I was just looking at over, behind me right now. So it's not to say that humans are the only species that manipulate their environment, but we manipulate the environment in ways in which other animals do not. So we create urban environments, built environments that are completely devoid of nature. I was actually speaking the other day to a colleague in Osaka, and my memory of being in Osaka some years ago was that there was no nature to be seen anywhere in the dense urban center of that city. And it's a really remarkable experience being there. And it's probably, you could say the same of areas of Tokyo or Yokohama, and other countries as well, Seoul. And, I'm sure that there are other countries where, nature has been sort of removed from the environment and all that you have is a built environment. But most of us live in environments where, you have access to a park like the one that I am in right now. Or you have a backyard where you might have grass, a lawn, some trees, a garden, things like that. So what we're really interested in environmental psychology are the interactions within and between natural and built environments. How do we create a good balance between the natural world and what we build? A second issue has to do with attachment to place. So the idea here is that people feel very strong, visceral, emotional attachments to places where they live. So for instance, if you are born in a rural environment where farm life is where you grew up with animals and you grew up tending to a farm or tending to the crops that are on a farm, you become attached to that. Other people grew up in urban environments, right? So they might grow up in a place like New York City or where I live in South Philadelphia, where they're attached to the kinds of resources and lifestyles that are associated with that kind of world. So attachment to place is something that is very important. Now, it's not to say that people that grew up in South Philadelphia don't end up, developing a affinity to rural lifestyles and end up going and living in a rural environment. It's just to say that most of the time, our constraints are our early experiences. Our developmental experiences really sort of shape the kinds of lifelong attachments that we might have to place. This plays a role in what we're talking about with offshore wind, because some people who have grown up, along the Jersey Shore, feel that it should never change, that there should never be anything done to manipulate that natural environment. And so it ends up being a really controversial issue where individuals do not want to see their very, cherished natural environments be changed by the installation of, say, offshore wind. Another issue within this domain has to do with personal space. In certain cultures, personal space is, a completely different idea than what we have in America. So, for instance, I'm sure that you can go on YouTube, or you may have seen videos of the Yamanote line in Tokyo. That's the line where they have personnel who are wearing white gloves and they push individuals into the trains because of the fact that, during rush hour, there's not enough trains for the number of people that need to move around. We're talking about a city with some, 25 million people. So what they do is they just press people into the train. And so the idea of personal space there is very different than in the US, where, I can assure you, here in Philadelphia, our train system is called SEPTA. There's no individual pushing people onto the trains and saying to people that they have to literally be on top of each other, which is what it was like. And when you come from an environment like that, I spent time in Tokyo, having grown up in Philadelphia and spent time in Chicago. It was a really weird experience to sort of be in a train and have, people almost like under your arm and things like that. It was a very interesting experience. So that's another interesting topic within environmental psychology. And next one is ergonomics. So ergonomics deals with the design of actual objects in the environment. So for instance, right now I'm talking into this microphone. Someone must have done some kind of research on the structure of this microphone, how it works. I have other things here. I have a little, Rutgers satchel for my computer. My bicycle is right here. So there are people that are out there that study this idea of how objects are designed to best afford human behavior. So for instance, on my bicycle, I have, and I could show this to you. Maybe I'll just, pull it over to there. You can see it right there. But I'm just going to describe it to you. So the initial bicycle that I bought had handlebars that you'd grab like this, okay? But after a while, once you've done, say, 5, 10 miles, your hands become numb. So what I have on this bicycle are these little wings that come up that allow me to hold, not like this, but hold the handlebars like this. And what that does is that relieves the pressure and totally makes that numb feeling go away. And that's what people who study ergonomics study, is the design of objects. How do we design objects to be afford? And that's a really important word in environmental psychology, the affordances. That goes back to someone named Gibson, who studied the idea of how certain objects afford certain behaviors. So when you get into an elevator, there's buttons. That affords pushing, right? So you push a button on an elevator. However, you go into a closet and there's a string that's hanging there that affords pulling, okay? So objects, you wouldn't push, a string that's hanging from a light bulb in a closet, just like you wouldn't sort of pull at a button that is in a elevator. So objects afford behaviors, and that was an important observation by this person. His name is J.J. Gibson, and that's sort of the basis of this idea of ergonomics. So another area is eco-psychology, how we as human beings consider ourselves or think about ourselves as part of a larger ecological context. That could be in terms of environmentalism, that could be more in terms of conservation issues, but eco-psychology has to do with how human beings think about their behavior in relation to the environment. I'll talk about a study on eco-psychology at the end of this little lecture, so we'll get to that in a minute. Another issue is restorative environments. Okay, a place like where I am right now, South Philly, this is JFK Park. This is a very restorative environment for those of us that live in a very urban environment. And in fact, this region behind me is a place that was called the Meadows. That was, I will, say to you that when you would walk through those meadows, you felt like you were maybe somewhere in Wisconsin, but you're in South Philadelphia. But it made you feel like you were in the middle of a rural environment. An environment like that is something which might restore your attention. How many near misses did I have on my bicycle ride down here, where this one person was turning off onto a highway overpass kind of thing and almost ran into me, and the honking of horns and just the sort of audacious noise of urban life. Coming to a place like here where you can hear the crickets and the silence is something which is so restorative to the human psyche. So this is one of the reasons why many people believe that, parks are important. You often hear people say, oh, what a waste of space that Central Park in New York is. Because look at, if we converted that into real estate, we could make not billions of dollars, but trillions of dollars. But is that worth completely ridding yourself of the kind of natural experiences that you can have by going into an environment like Central Park? And I want to emphasize, though, that Central Park is not a natural environment. It was an environment that was designed by a landscape architect named Olmsted, who created an environment that was, just not there. But people kind of think that, Central Park is sort of like a region that was just like nature left to itself. No, it was completely designed by a landscape architect, like every stone in there. And he was very much informed by philosophies that came out from the more of the 1800s than environmental psychology that have to do with that. In any case, having restorative environments is really important and useful for individuals to escape from the kind of urban environments in which they might have to live in, or because of jobs or other aspects. But I also want to say this: those that live in very rural environments, they often long for built environments. This is one of the reasons why people actually go to take tours of cities in Europe. It's why you go to Rome or you go to Paris. You want to see built environments, such as the Arc de Triomphe, or whether it be other structures there. It's not just natural environments that people are looking for. Another issue has to do with what's called proxemics and territorialism. This is an issue that certain individuals have beliefs about their land being theirs, and you can see this with what's going on in 2022 and 23 with the Ukraine and Russia. Territorialism has become a really huge issue. And so where you come from, where you originate from, um, is an important aspect of how we think about ourselves and our identity. And so this is, one of those issues that's very big in environmental psychology. And then finally, environmental consciousness. This actually goes back to my point in eco-psychology, so I'm not going to sort of reiterate those points. But one of the important issues that we study in environmental psychology is to what extent people are conscious or knowledgeable about these issues. So right now I'm doing research on offshore wind, and I have to ask people to what extent they know anything about it. And most people admit they don't know anything about it because it's not in their wheelhouse. Unless you're someone that's in the energy sector or the environment sector, you might not know anything about what's going on with offshore wind. So making people conscious of what's going on and educate them is a really important aspect of environmental psychology as well. So a more complicated model has to do with what's called the theory of reasoned action. It was by Jean and colleague in 1980. And the idea here is that we have evaluative beliefs about the consequences of our behavior. So I might think that, yes, recycling is a good thing, but I have a can right here that I'm going to have to carry halfway across the city. That's inconvenient for me, so I'm just going to throw it away in that trash can that I see right over there. But there's also normative beliefs that have to do with how others would view performance of the behavior and the motivation to comply with these, views. So imagine that there was a chorus of people watching. Here in this park, there's no one around me. But let's say that, I have a couple of colleagues that I'm walking down, a hallway with, and there is a recycling bin and a trash can. To what extent is the fact that I'm being viewed by other people affecting the degree to which the likelihood that I'm going to throw this can into the trash can or the recycling bin? Now, I think that one of the better studies that has been done about this actually was by a person named Cialdini, who studied the behavior of reusing towels in hotels. And we all know that those of us who have stayed in hotels recently, that there are this sort of idea that you can either hang your towels up to dry and reuse them or get fresh towels every day if you stay for multiple days in a hotel. So what Cialdini did is he wanted to see whether or not there was any message that you could put into a hotel that would change people's behavior. And so what he did in one condition is said he put signs in randomly divided these rooms into one condition or another condition, which is the hallmark of a great experiment. So randomly, rooms were assigned to an environmental condition or a normative condition. And in the environmental condition, the bathroom in the hotel room had a little placard that said, "Be kind to the environment. Reuse your towel by just putting it up, hanging it up again, and that's, being friendly to the environment." Something like that. In the other condition, he put signs and said, 75% of the guests who stay at at this hotel, they reuse their towels by hanging up on the, and reusing them. Why don't you join them? And what happened is that in the environmental condition, relative to, there was a third condition where there was no placard. Okay, so in the environmental condition, there was no real significant difference between, rooms that had no placard at all and one that said, "Do this for the environment." But there was a significant increase in the number of people reusing their towels in the condition where they were reminded of the normative, the idea that social others also reuse their towels. So that's a really important thing, having to do with how social others influences the degree to which people are willing to, reuse their towels. And now, of course, hotels and towels, that's one kind of very constrained domain. But just think about this in terms of things like recycling and I know there's issues with recycling now in, 2023 that are problematic because, and need to be dealt with. But even things like, reducing one's impact on the environment in terms of driving less or buying a smaller car, these messages do matter. And knowing what other people do and, what the ideal behavior of the people really constrains people. So I think that this is like the important thing about this model, and it goes into the attitudes towards behavior, intentions, the relative importance of attitudinal and normative considerations, and also subjective norms. Because there's also subjectivity here. So that's one model. I think this is a really a good model to understand. So another model by Hines et al. Is about attitudes, locus of control, and personal responsibility. So we start out with, you might have attitudes about, behavior and about environmentalism, but you also have the idea of your locus of control. And that's something which is really important that I've found in my research with environmentalism, is that, you often talk to people and they say, well, it's out of my control. I'm just a little guy who, I drink 3 cans of soda a week. What impact is that having on the environment? What matter of control do I have over this? When at the same time we have, container ships that, burn, hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel. So, one's ability to have control over a particular situation is very important. And psychologists have recognized this for a long time. And so that feeds into this idea of personality factors. There's also this notion of idea of issues, because if you don't know about the issue, and that's one of the surprising things that I've done with research on offshore wind, is the extent to which people just don't even know about the issue at all. They've never even heard of offshore wind. Knowledge of action strategies and action skills, how well you are at being able to actually put into plan a goal-oriented plan to sort of do things that are, pro-environmental. All of that feeds in this idea of intention to act, but there's also situational factors. Situational factors being how easy it is, how convenient it is, and that ends up being 2 factors that feed into this idea of pro-environmental behavior. Another model from 1981 by Feetkow and Kessel has to do with the possibilities to act pro-environmentally. Some of us don't have that opportunity to act in a way that's pro-environmental. I've seen this recently in some videos that I've been watching about the recycling of batteries, where batteries have lead, and lead is a valuable commodity. And what they have been doing is just, breaking open car batteries, pouring the acid that's in that into rivers, and taking the lead out of that. And the problem, though, is that, again, there's no possibility to act pro-environmentally. In the context of this, which is in Western Africa, there really isn't a recycling center that could take these batteries and take the sulfuric acid and do something which is, beneficial to people. And also incentives. One of the things that often, psychologists don't focus on, but economists do, is the idea of incentive structures. There's a reason why in places like Germany, last time that I traveled in Germany, I was told that what you should do if you have a bottle of a drink or a can, don't throw it into the trash receptacle. Instead, put it outside. Because there are people in Germany that will go and collect these cans and bottles and recycle them. They'll bring them to a recycling center where they get paid, because there's a deposit in that country. And you can see that. I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan for 2 years, and there is a incentive structure that they have there where you pay a deposit on bottles that you buy, and you have to bring those bottles back to the store that you bought them from, and then you put them into this machine, and then it gives you a little receipt that pays you for the deposit. So incentives play a really important role in getting people to engage in environmental activity. And I think that that's something that always remind ourselves, is that as psychologists, we tend to think attitudes matter, values matter, emotions matter. But no, incentives also, the kind of monetary value associated with a behavior, can really change and make it really important, effect. And also, this is affected by knowledge in this model and environmental attitudes and values, and also the perceived consequences of behavior. If you don't think that your behavior has much of an impact, like the can of soda that I could throw into that trash can over there, that's not going to really impact the world in any significant way, then that will constrain the degree to which you're going to act in any kind of significant way. Other models, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I realize that I'm now at 30 minutes, and I want to never have any of these go beyond 40 minutes, that have to do with barriers. Individual barriers, individuals within a social context, but also social and institutional barriers. If you work at a business or an institution like a university that doesn't have recycling bins, and I'll say this about Rutgers, when I first started working at Rutgers in 2005, there was no recycling. And so a student of mine and I went to the facilities director and said, hey, why don't we have recycling here at Rutgers? And he said, well, we had recycling at one time, but we found that the students at Rutgers weren't conscientious about it. They weren't recycling. They just would sort of throw trash in the recycling bin and recycling in the trash bin. And that ended up being the source of actually a paper that I published having to do with how you design the lids of recycling bins to make them have better affordances to have people actually engage in recycling. But the point is that there's barriers, that there are individual institutional barriers that prevent people from, engaging in environmental behavior. And kind of, attacking those barriers is a really important part of this model. This is Blake in 1999. And here we have a far more complicated model having to do with internal factors, external factors, knowledge, values, attributes. This model that comes from Kolmus and Agerman is a very complicated model. And one thing I want to say about models in general is something that the statistician George Box once said, which is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. What he was trying to say there is that there's no great model that statisticians can use to explain behavior, but they're useful in that they kind of give suggestions for future research. So I'm not sure that this complicated model of old behavioral patterns and pro-environment behavior, I just think that it's useful to point out that idea that models are useful, but not all of them are exactly correct. But I do want to talk about one model. So this model by P. Wesley Schultz has to do with the structure of environmental concerns, concern for the self, other people, and the biosphere. So this was a very influential paper in my own experience in learning about environmental psychology. And so I really appreciated what work he did in coming up with this. And the idea is this, is that there are certain concerns that we can have and reasons for engaging in actions that affect the environment. Some of them might be egocentric. They might have to do with, I'm concerned about how what humans are doing that affect the environment affects me, my health, my lifestyle, or my future. And so we call those egocentric concerns. And those concerns are very distinct from other kinds of concerns that individuals have. So one might be concerned about how the human behavior affects all people, or children, or my children, or people in my country. Okay, those we consider altruistic concerns. This paper came out in the early 2000s. I would have probably added people in other countries as well, because, for instance, climate change affects not just people in my country, but people in all countries. And then there's this idea of biospheric concerns, the extent to which things that humans do affect plants, marine life, animals, and birds. And one of the things that we find in this research is when you look at the correlation coefficients between measures of environmental concern, empathy, and self-reported behavior, you find that biospheric concerns, which is this, you see at the top number 1, and you go down, biospheric concerns are correlated with altruistic concerns, egocentric concerns, egoistic, and all of these other measures of environmental behaviors. But what we find is that, to the extent that these other measures are correlated, egocentric concerns, which is this 3, when you look at the top 1, 2, 3, and you go down, they're not correlated at all with other measures of environmental concern, such as perspective taking, empathetic concern, personal distress, inclusion of nature and self. So those individuals that are concerned about the effects that humans are having on the environment only on the impacts that have to do with themselves look very different than those that are influenced by the impacts that it has on the biosphere or these altruistic concerns about future generations. So I think that this is a very interesting and very useful environmental psychology study to look at what are people's motivations or what are their concerns that influence the degree to which they might be motivated to engage in behaviors that might benefit the environment. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in a later slide. But in summary, because I want to end this before 40 minutes, environmental psychology is a branch of psychology that deals with human interactions within their natural and built environments. It's a useful field for applied purposes such as the design of parks, architecture, cities, other contexts in which humans manipulate their natural environment. And it also has a predictive and prescriptive value. I think that environmental psychology has been one of the more interesting and dynamic parts of psychology that I've been involved in. And I hope that some of what I've talked about today might get you interested as well as considering yourself to be an environmental psychologist. So I'll see you in the next lecture.